Watch how Makhnev turns a quiet Catalan into a slow squeeze, then offers a whole rook for a single pawn, and that pawn, buried deep in Black's camp, becomes the one thing Valiev cannot stop. This is the Vladimir Dvorkovich Open, 2026, and it ends with a bishop quietly taming a rook. Makhnev opens with the queen's pawn striding to d4, staking an immediate claim in the center and signaling a slow, strategic battle rather than a brawl. White wants space and the kind of patient game where small advantages quietly pile up over time. Valiev answers in kind, planting his own pawn on d5 and meeting White head-on in the middle of the board. Black stakes an equal share of the center, a classical reply that says he is happy to fight for these squares rather than concede them. Out comes the c-pawn to c4, the queen's gambit move, gently prodding at Black's d5 point. White is not really sacrificing anything, he is asking Black a question about the center and preparing to develop with maximum pressure on the long lines. With the modest pawn to e6, Valiev shores up d5 and opens a path for his king's bishop. It is the most solid setup in the book, keeping the structure sound while accepting that his queenside bishop may sit passive for a while. Makhnev posts the knight on f3, eyeing the central squares and keeping his options flexible. This is the move order that steers toward the Catalan, calm development first, with the real idea, a bishop fiancé, arriving next. Mirroring again, Valiev develops his knight to f6, the natural square where it guards d5 and pressures White's center. Both armies are unfolding smoothly, each piece going to its best home before the tension is set. This is the defining moment of the opening, the pawn slides to g3, clearing the way for a bishop to settle on g2. This is the Catalan, Makhnev's bishop will rake the entire long diagonal toward Black's queenside, a quiet pressure that can last the whole game. Valiev fires in a check, the bishop leaping to b4 and forcing White to deal with it before that fiancé is complete. It is a standard Catalan idea, nudge White into committing a piece and break the smooth flow of his development for a moment. Makhnev calmly interposes the bishop on d2, blocking the check without fuss. The move looks humble, but the bishop is content to be traded or shuffled here, and White keeps every long term plus the Catalan promises on the kingside diagonal. Rather than swap, Valiev tucks the bishop back to e7, content to lose a little time for a rock-solid structure. Black accepts a passive but extremely sturdy position, the kind that is hard to crack but also hard to generate counterplay from. Now the star piece arrives, Makhnev's bishop settles on g2, and suddenly that long diagonal hums with energy all the way to b7. This is the soul of the Catalan, a bishop that quietly pressures Black's queenside for the next 30 moves. Black castles into safety, sliding the king to g8 and linking the rooks. It is the healthy, sensible choice, king off the center before things ignite, and Valiev's position is now compact, harmonious, and ready to soak up whatever Makhnev sends his way. Makhnev follows suit, castling his own king to safety on g1. Both sides have done their housekeeping, kings safely home, pieces out, and the real strategic conversation, about pawn breaks and that humming diagonal, is ready to begin. Valiev props up the center with the pawn to c6, choosing the closed Catalan. The idea is patience, keep d5 firmly defended, refuse to release the tension, and dare White to find a way through a wall that has no obvious cracks. The queen steps out to c2, a typical Catalan post where she eyes the c-file and supports a future central advance. Makhnev is in no hurry, he develops with purpose, lining up his forces before deciding exactly where to strike. Valiev completes his development, the queenside knight coming to d7 where it supports a later break with e5 or c5. Black's pieces are now all in sensible spots, a textbook closed Catalan formation just waiting for the middle game to take shape. Makhnev lifts a rook to d1, placing it behind his queen's pawn and quietly aiming down the d-file. It is prophylaxis and preparation in one, the rook supports a central push later and discourages Black from freeing his game with an early break. Valiev throws a flank pawn forward to a5, grabbing queenside space and eyeing a further push to a4 to cramp White. It is an ambitious choice, Black wants activity on the wing where his structure points, and this pawn becomes a lasting character in the game. Makhnev reroutes the bishop to f4, off the back rank and onto a more active diagonal where it watches Black's kingside. The piece had done its job blocking the check, now it joins the action, adding a little menace toward the squares around Black's king. On comes the pawn to a4, fixing itself deep in White's half and becoming a permanent thorn. Valiev gains queenside space and a target, This little pawn will dictate a surprising amount of the strategy, and both players know it. Makhnev pushes the h-pawn to h4, a bold gain of space that hints at kingside ambitions. It loosens his own king slightly, but the point is to grab squares and keep black's pieces from settling comfortably near the edge of the board. Out swings the queen to a5, supporting black's advanced a-pawn and adding weight to the queen side. Valiev coordinates his forces around that pawn chain, content to keep the center closed while the action gathers on the wings. Makhnev plays the small but useful pawn to a3, putting a question to black's a4 pawn and securing the b4 square against intruders. It is the kind of quiet restraining move that defines mature play, removing the opponent's ideas before pursuing your own. Valiev leaps the knight to e4, the classic outpost in the center of the board. From there it eyes white's bishop on d2 and the squares around the king, a strong, active post that demands respect and signals black is ready to fight for the initiative. Makhnev develops the last knight to d2, immediately challenging that proud e4 steed and offering to trade it off. Bring out your pieces and contest the strong squares. White refuses to let black's knight sit there unopposed in the heart of the position. To cement the knight, Valiev pushes the pawn to f5, locking the e4 square in his favor and grabbing kingside space. It loosens the cover around his own king slightly, but the reward is a powerful, beautifully supported knight sitting right in white's face. Makhnev jumps the knight to g5, sidestepping the trade and probing toward the weakened squares near black's king. The horse eyes e6 and the soft points that f5 created. White keeps the pieces on and looks for chances in the rising complications. Valiev brings the other knight back into play, swinging it to f6 to bolster his king side and keep an eye on white's active pieces. Black calmly improves, unwilling to be rushed, trusting that his solid structure can weather white's probing on the flank. Now the trades begin. Makhnev's knight captures on e4, removing black's beautifully placed centerpiece. It is the right moment to clarify. White eliminates the annoying outpost and forces black to recapture, opening lines and changing the character of the middle game. Valiev recaptures with the knight from f6, restoring the piece on e4 and keeping a knight on that strong square. The structure shifts and the position sharpens, both armies now committed to a more open, double-edged fight than the quiet opening promised. Makhnev clamps the queen side with the pawn to c5, grabbing space and fixing the structure to his liking. The push gains room and eyes the b6 square, the first hint of the plan that will eventually decide the game, pressure and a passed pawn on the queen side. Valiev strikes back in the center with the pawn to e5, hitting white's bishop on f4 and trying to open lines for his own pieces. It is an energetic bid for activity. Black does not want to sit passively while white expands, so he creates tension of his own. Makhnev grabs the pawn on e5 with the bishop, winning material and planting the piece on a commanding central square. From e5 the bishop towers over the board, eyeing both flanks at once and reminding Valiev that every pawn break can leave weaknesses behind. Valiev snaps off the knight on g5, trading pieces to relieve some of the pressure bearing down on him. Each exchange simplifies the position, and black hopes that fewer pieces means fewer dangers, even as white's bishops grow in stature on the open board. The h-pawn does the recapturing, swinging up to g5 and pulling the h-file open for white's rook. It keeps material level and hands Makhnev a half-open file aimed straight at black's kingside, a small structural gift that may matter later. Valiev's bishop swings out to g5, recovering the pawn and emerging as an active piece on a fine diagonal. Black has untangled nicely through the trades, the bishop is free, the position is simplifying, and Valiev feels he is holding the balance comfortably. Makhnev underpins his center with the modest pawn to e3, giving his pieces a stable base and shoring up the d4 point. It is an unflashy consolidating move. White is in no rush, content to keep the structure sound while his bishops eye the long-term targets. Valiev redeploys the bishop to f6, hitting white's pieces and pressuring the long diagonal from his side. Black is trying to neutralize Makhnev's powerful bishop and trade away white's most dangerous attacker, the standard recipe for diffusing a Catalan grip. Makhnev slides the bishop back to f4, declining the trade and keeping his powerful piece on the board. Why swap off your best attacker? White preserves the tension and the bishop pair's potential, betting that his pieces will prove more useful than black's in the long run. Onto the open file goes Valiev's rook, swinging to e8 to add weight to the central fight. Black keeps harmonizing, rook on the file, bishop active, king tucked away, quietly insisting that he stands perfectly fine in this position. Makhnev expands further with the pawn to b4, grabbing queenside space and offering black an en passant capture. White is building a broad pawn front on the wing where he holds the edge, intent on creating a passed pawn and a rolling majority that black must constantly watch. Valiev takes en passant, the a4 pawn capturing on b3 and changing the queenside structure in an instant. It is the kind of capture casual fans miss, a pawn taking as if the enemy had only moved one square, and it opens fresh lines on the queen side. Makhnev's queen scoops up the pawn on b3, re-centralizing and turning her gaze toward black's king and queenside weaknesses. The recapture keeps material even and improves the queen. She is active on the b-file now, pressuring b7 and the soft squares the trades have left behind. Valiev pulls his queen back to d8, regrouping to a safer, more flexible square. From d8 she can swing to either flank and help shore up the defense. Black is content to untangle and consolidate, trusting his solid structure to hold white's pressure at bay. Makhnev advances the a-pawn to a4, launching his queenside passer on its long journey. This is the of white's whole plan, a far advanced pawn supported by pieces, the kind of asset that grows more dangerous with every square it gains. Counterplay is the goal as Valiev advances the h-pawn to h5, claiming space on the kingside to offset white's queenside march. Sitting still would invite a slow squeeze, so black stakes ground on the far wing and hunts for targets of his own. Makhnev's queen lunges to b6, deep into black's position and clamping down on the queenside. From here she eyes weak pawns and ties black's pieces to defense, a bold infiltration that turns up the pressure and forces Valiev to react to white's agenda. Valiev answers with the queen to e7, defending key squares and keeping his forces knitted together. Black is on the back foot now, responding to white's initiative rather than dictating play, but the position holds. There are no immediate cracks for Makhnev to exploit. The a-pawn rolls onward to a5, one step nearer promotion and one more square claimed. Makhnev keeps his passer marching, methodically nursing his trump card while Valiev scrambles to build a blockade and slow the advance. Valiev repositions the queen to d7, looking to challenge white's active lady and ease the pressure through exchanges. Trading queens would blunt much of white's attacking force. Black would love to reach a calmer endgame where his solid structure counts for more. Staying aggressive, Makhnev places the queen on c7, harassing black from deep inside his camp instead of backing off. White keeps the pressure on, the queen ties Valiev to defense and probes patiently for the first real crack. The bishop darts to d8, where Valiev attacks white's queen and demands an answer. Black aims to trade pieces or drive the intruder back, anything to break up Makhnev's deep coordination and earn a moment of relief from the constant pressure. Makhnev accepts the trade, his queen capturing on d7 and steering the game toward an endgame. With the queens coming off, the position simplifies, and crucially, white's queenside pawns and bishops are perfectly suited to the kind of patient ending that now lies ahead. Back comes the bishop from c8 to grab the queen on d7, and the players enter an endgame Valiev hopes he can hold. Queens off, tension eased a notch, but Makhnev still owns the more dangerous pieces and those advanced queenside pawns. Makhnev shifts a rook to b1, lining it up behind his queenside pawns and preparing to push the advance home. The rook supports the pawns and eyes the b-file, the highway down which white intends to deliver his passed pawn, methodical, purposeful endgame play. Retreating to regroup, Valiev sets the bishop on c8 to guard the queenside and watch those advancing pawns. Black plays a careful waiting game, parking his pieces on the right defensive squares and daring Makhnev to find a concrete breakthrough. Here's the boldest decision on the board, and the frowns on it. Makhnev thrusts the rook to b6, offering the whole piece, when the calm pawn to a6 was cleaner, simply marching the passer along. He is playing for a monster pawn on b6, and he will give up material to get it. Valiev accepts, the bishop capturing the rook on b6. How could he refuse a full exchange? But this is exactly what Makhnev wanted. The recapture is coming, and it will leave white with a pawn buried deep in black's position, supported and almost impossible to dislodge. There it is, the c-pawn recaptures on b6, and that soldier now sits one rank from glory, protected and menacing. White is down the exchange, true, but this passed pawn is worth its weight in gold. It cramps black, ties his pieces to defense, and dreams of promotion. Over goes the rook to e6, where Valiev hopes to blockade or harass the dangerous b6 pawn and stir up activity. Black must address the passer before it becomes overwhelming. The rook tries to get behind it, but the pawn is stubbornly well guarded. Makhnev returns the bishop to f3, back onto its glorious long diagonal where it pressures black's queenside and supports the passed pawn from afar. The bishop and pawn work as a team now, one pushes, the other guards the path, a classic Catalan partnership coming to fruition. Valiev gives the king some air with the pawn to g6, bracing the kingside. With the queens long gone, the king becomes a fighting piece. Black is preparing to march his monarch toward the center where it can help hold things together. Makhnev begins walking his king toward the action, stepping to f1. In the endgame the king is a powerful piece, and white brings his into play, heading for the center and the queen side, where it can support the passer and tip the balance of force. Valiev mirrors the plan, his king striding to f7 and starting its own journey toward the center. Both kings are on the move now. This is pure endgame technique, where activating the monarch can matter more than any single piece, and neither side wants to be left behind. Makhnev's king continues its march to e2, steadily approaching the heart of the board. There is no hurry in this kind of position. White improves his king one careful square at a time, knowing the long-term trumps, the passer and the bishop, are firmly on his side. Valiev advances the king to f6, centralizing and keeping pace with white's monarch. Black's whole defensive idea rests on activity now, an active king, a rook that harasses, anything to distract white from simply shepherding that b6 pawn toward the finish line. The king presses on to d3, with Makhnev guiding his monarch ever closer to the queenside battleground. The plan stays unhurried and clear: bring the king up, unite it with bishop and pawn, and squeeze every drop of activity out of Valiev's game. Valiev gains kingside space with the pawn to g5, readying his own pawn advance as counterplay. He has to manufacture threats somewhere. A storm on the kingside is his best practical chance to muddy the water before white's queenside steamroller rolls in. Makhnev maneuvers the bishop to c7, finding a strong post where it supports the queenside pawns and eyes new diagonals. The bishop is the perfect escort. From c7 it can guard the passer's path and switch to active duty in a single move. Valiev's king returns to e7, covering important squares and staying flexible. Black keeps recalculating where the monarch belongs, defense and counterplay pulling opposite ways, as he struggles to hold the position together against white's mounting pressure. Makhnev marches the king to c3, another patient step toward the decisive sector. White's technique is a clinic in slow improvement, no wasted motion, no premature commitment, just the king inching toward the queenside to lend its weight where it matters most. Valiev brings the rook to h6, shifting it toward the kingside to support his pawns and seek counterplay. The rook is hunting for a way behind the marching g and h pawns, or into white's camp, anything to spark the threats black's defense badly needs. Makhnev's king arrives on b4, right in the thick of the queenside where the game will be decided. The monarch has completed its long walk, now it stands ready to support the passed pawn, escort it forward, and add the final push of force white needs. Seeking lines, Valiev advances the h-pawn to h4, trying to crack open the kingside and give his rook a target. This is black's counterplay in motion: make weaknesses, open files, conjure threats quickly enough to pull white's attention from the queenside before it is too late. Makhnev captures on h4 with the g-pawn, taking the offered pawn and keeping his structure intact. White is happy to grab material and deny black the open lines he craves. Every trade that does not help the defender brings the passed pawn one step closer to deciding things. Valiev wins the pawn back, the rook taking on h4 and springing to life along the fourth rank. The rook is loose now, raking across the board. Black finally has his active piece, though whether it offsets white's queenside trumps is the whole question. Makhnev redeploys the bishop to g3, attacking the active rook and gaining a tempo while defending. It is neat coordination. The bishop chases the rook off its strong square and keeps white's pieces working together, all while the queenside passer waits patiently in the wings. Sidestepping the bishop, the rook returns to h6, still eyeing the action. Valiev keeps juggling defense and counterplay, placing the piece on safe yet useful squares and refusing to let Makhnev consolidate quietly, even as the position grows harder. Makhnev parks the bishop on e2, eyeing the kingside pawns and the a6 to f1 diagonal that will matter later. The bishop is flexible, covering important squares, ready to attack black's weaknesses or support the passer, a quiet improving move with future purpose baked in. Valiev centralizes the king to e6, keeping it active and ready to support his pawns or contest the center. Black's monarch is doing real work in this endgame, but it is a delicate balance, too active and it gets exposed, too passive and the defense collapses under white's pressure. Makhnev activates the rook to g1, targeting black's kingside pawns and threatening to win one of them. White's last piece joins the party, now the rook, bishop, king, and passed pawn all point at black's position, and the pressure becomes almost impossible to meet. Valiev slips the rook to h3, infiltrating white's position and going after the pawns from behind. It is active defense. Black creates his own threats rather than passively waiting, hoping the rook's raid can win material or distract white just long enough to matter. The bishop retreats to c7, where Makhnev guards the queenside once more and keeps the passer's path clear. The piece dances between attack and defense, and its priority now is the b6 pawn. White will not let anything disturb the soldier destined to decide this game. Valiev shoves the g-pawn to g4, pressing his kingside counterplay and supporting the rook's invasion. Black is throwing everything at his only real chance, the kingside pawns and the active rook, racing to generate threats before white's queenside avalanche buries him. Makhnev redirects the bishop to f4, attacking black's rook and gaining yet another tempo. White keeps the pieces dancing in perfect harmony, every move pressures something, the bishop and rook combining to harass black while the passed pawn sits there, patient and lethal. Valiev retreats the rook to h8, dodging the bishop and seeking a new path into white's camp. The rook keeps probing for an entry point, black refusing to give up on counterplay, but with every shuffle white's grip tightens and the passer creeps closer to its moment. The rook relocates to c1, Makhnev lining it up for the decisive queenside operations ahead. The rook eyes the open file and ready support for the breakthrough. White is settling his pieces into their final places before the blow that turns a long advantage into a win. And here's the slip that opens the door for white. Valiev plays the bishop to d7, when the king belonged on that square instead. King to d7 would have rushed the monarch toward the queenside to help fight the passer. With the bishop there and the king stranded, Makhnev's breakthrough is now coming. Makhnev strikes with the pawn to a6, cracking open the queenside and beginning the decisive breakthrough. The passers are rolling now. This little pawn smashes into black's structure, and the threats of promotion multiply faster than Valiev can possibly contain them. Valiev captures on a6 with the b-pawn, forced to take but in doing so opening the very file white wants. Every capture here seems to help the attacker. The structure crumbles, lines open toward black's king and queen side, and the b6 pawn stands prouder than ever. The king joins the assault, stepping to a5 as Makhnev throws its strength into the queenside attack. The monarch is a full attacking piece now, supporting the pawns, threatening to march further, and helping white convert his pressure into something decisive. The final misstep arrives. Valiev sends the king to e7, when the bishop had to drop back to c8 to stop the pawn from reaching b7. With the bishop on the wrong square, white's passer now has a clear road to promotion, and the game is effectively over. The pawn surges to b7, a single step from a new queen and utterly unstoppable. This is the dream Makhnev chased when he gave up the exchange so long ago. His passer has reached the 7th rank, and black's pieces have no answer to it. Valiev throws the rook to b8, the only way to stop the pawn from promoting, for now. The rook is forced into a miserable, passive blockade, glued to the back rank to prevent a new queen, while white prepares the final blow that will win the piece outright. It ends, fittingly, with the Catalan bishop. Makhnev captures on a6, and from there it guards the b7 pawn. The rook on b8 is helpless, glued to the blockade while a new queen looms. The very piece this whole opening is built around delivers the final word, the exchange sacrifice fully vindicated. Valiev resigns.